this is a conversation we've long wanted to have. At 90, Daniel Ellsberg, the father of American whistleblowing, the Pentagon paper whistleblower, is still working overtime for peace and justice. Or as Esquire recently put it, Daniel Ellsberg is still, quote, causing trouble. As our correspondent Sasha Abramsky put it in a March profile of Dan, if I might, the older he gets, the more Ellsberg sees himself as being on a moral mission to open eyes kept deliberately shut by those who would prefer to avoid having to deal with the crises of our time. To get them to see the perils of nuclear weapons, the conflict of war, the perils of militarism, and most recently, an existential issue Dan has been thinking and writing about, the climate emergency. In 2017, Dan published a must-read book for anyone who cares about the survival of the species, The Doomsday Machine, Confessions of a Nuclear Planner. It offers riveting, firsthand, frightening testimony about the nuclear insanity, which gets criminally little media attention or public attention. Most on this call know of Dan's momentous decision to leak over 7,000 classified documents to the New York Times and Washington Post, revealing the Vietnam War was based on a web of lies. The Times started publishing the documents June 13th, 1971. I hope I have my facts right. Nearly 2 years after Dan made copies at the Rand Corporation, where he had worked, in their offices and carried them out of the door in a briefcase. Put on trial for 12 charges in connection with violations of the Espionage Act, an act that continues to be wielded recklessly to suppress news the public deserves to know. Charges were punishable by up to 115 years in prison. Charges were dismissed, however, in 1973, due not only to a crack legal team, I believe Leonard Boudin, Leonard Weinglass, others, but especially because of government misconduct against Ellsberg. We were talking before we came on about Judge Matt Byrne and Nixon and J. Edgar Hoover, a story. By the way, Julian Assange, who Dan has come to the defense of, he testified in support of Assange in September 2020, faces charges carrying a maximum sentence of 175 years. Half a century after leaking the Pentagon Papers, Dan remains deeply engaged with anti-nuclear activism, sanity, writing, speaking. He feels that responsibility to alert Americans and others around the world to the growing and unchecked nuclear danger. Not slowing down, not a chance. He told the nation, Sasha Abramsky, I will be trying to alert people to that till the day I die. I think our nuclear policy is so dangerously delusional as the belief that the pandemic is a hoax and there's no man-made climate change. Dan, I want to close before we turn to a few questions, and so honored to have you here. The back of your book, one of the blurbs, is by someone I had the chance to interview 5 or 6 years ago, and someone I believe you admire, Edward Snowden. He's on the, and he writes, this long-awaited chronicle from the father of American whistleblowing is both an urgent warning and a call to arms to a public that has grown dangerously habituated to the idea that the means of our extinction will forever be on hair trigger alert. Daniel Ellsberg's courage, conviction, and candor have been a model for me and so many others who were inspired by his example. I just want to be clear, I mean, that those who think the Pentagon Papers, the issues of secrecy, of the need for whistleblowing is in the past, are dangerously, dangerously wrong. And I want to just ask you a question, because just the other week, in fact, you were back in the news as a whistleblower, but you were leaking a top secret 1966 study about the Taiwan Strait crisis, which you say you copied at the time of the Pentagon Papers, but didn't disclose. Why are you sharing these documents now? Is there a link to the idea of challenging this growing prosecution of using the Espionage Act? And thank you, Dan.
Thank you. On that last point, it is absurd to think that I should be prosecuted, though I could be, for putting out this 50-year-old study of decision-making that its author, Mort Halpern, said recently, after I'd put it out, should never have been classified in the first place. When he put it out in 1966, it dealt with decision-making in 1958. Unfortunately, there's no reason to think that decision-making has grown more wise or more prudent over the years. And what led me to emphasize this right now is the fact that Taiwan is in the news. The president is being pressed by members of both parties to commit the United States for the first time, breaking assurances actually that were given to the Chinese when we recognized China officially as the government of China in 1979 under Carter. That was 40 years ago, changing that to committing ourselves without act of Congress. Can the president do that? Well, he has done that. Presidents have been doing that. Committing ourselves to the military defense of Taiwan, in effect, making it formally a ally and recognizing it as a sovereign nation, it would seem, since we're committing ourselves to its defense, when Xi, the leader of China, and most Chinese, it appears, has said for more than 40 years that formal recognition of Taiwan as being not part of China, but an independent state, would be a cause for war. So we're moving toward war, it would seem, quite possibly with the tendencies to declare it, to challenge this warning by the Chinese in an area of the world where now as then, the ability of the United States to prevail in a strictly conventional war, 100 miles off the Chinese coast, thousands of miles from us, is very much in question. And the possibility or the necessity, perhaps, of escalating that war to US first use of nuclear weapons was always in our planning, as this 1958 study shows very clearly, and is certainly to be under discussion and consideration right now. And that would be initiating a war against a nuclear state, China, which should be recognized as an insane move. And yet threats of such an insane move have been the essence of our foreign policy and our alliance policy, our military policy for 70 years. It's time then, I think, to challenge that. And I hope that putting out this earlier decision-making would make people realize that this kind of policy has always been wrong-headed and reckless for the whole existence of the human species and must be changed now.
I wanted to ask you in the context of the power of whistleblowing. So reality winner remains in prison, Edward Snowden in exile. Assange faces 175 years in prison. There are other less well-known whistleblowers. I think of Thomas Drake, who've been targeted, prosecuted, jailed. How do you see the state of whistleblowing in this time? Is it still relevant in order to do what you did, which is to bring to the attention of people? Is it still a matter of high secrecy that needs to be pierced? Are there new forms? When I think of you walking out with a briefcase, when you look at the new forms, you must think, this is not that, it was tougher for me, the Xerox machine and the briefcase.
I couldn't have copied the hundreds of thousands of pages that were involved in leaks by Chelsea Manning and Edward Snowden on a Xerox machine. I couldn't have carried them out in a briefcase, of course. So the ability to convey those to the public is very, very much greater than it used to be. But the chance of being discovered is at least as high as it ever was, especially with the surveillance of newspapers that we've seen, both legal and illegal, mainly illegal, warrantless wiretapping of reporters now make it possible, as in the case of Jeffrey Sterling, for example, who went to prison based purely on the circumstantial evidence of his communications, the metadata of his talks to a reporter, James Risen. And Risen himself was a rare, at that time, rare case.
James Risen, yeah.
James Risen of the New York Times, they tried to make him testify who his source was. That's why I do want to challenge the use of the Espionage Act as it has been in this century primarily, to use it like a British type Official Secrets Act, which criminalizes any and all release of classified information regardless of intent or motive or public interest or impact. None of that can be brought up in the trial, which means that none of the whistleblowers who are trying to inform the public, enable our democracy to function and survive, none of them has been able to have a fair trial. Snowden could not have a fair trial here, nor Assange, because he would not be able to answer the question why he did what he did, or in Chelsea's case, why she did what she did. I was already not able to answer that in my trial, which means I didn't really get a fair trial, although by a miraculous convergence of circumstances, I did manage to escape what was essentially a rigged trial. So I'm here to talk to you now. With my sentence, I could still be in prison. Now, I am willing to risk that today to raise this issue to the first Supreme Court, where it has never been addressed. I will not be making a plea deal. And when you talk about 175 years possibly facing young Julian Assange or Ed Snowden, that doesn't have the same meaning for me at 90. A life sentence would be a lot shorter for me. But in any case, it's been a cause of mine for so long to bring it out. There's no question that whistleblowing is as needed, more needed than ever. We've never had as many whistleblowers as we needed or should have been, should have come out, and moves toward making them even more dangerous for them to do it, especially for journalists now for the first time. Julian Assange is the first time that a journalist has been indicted under the Espionage Act, which means that's a blatant violation of the First Amendment, of the freedom of the press. And it's even hard for me to imagine that the government really wants to extradite him, although Biden himself, that is his Justice Department, has renewed the appeal to get him extradited. But I was just thinking last night, can they really want a case to go, especially up to the Supreme Court, involving a journalist who put out information that, by the way, was no more than secret, whereas all the information I put out in 71 or 2 weeks ago was all top secret. Do they really want to try that case? They lose, I think, the Espionage Act, I would like to think, as a constitutional, and yet with the current court, of course, one can't be sure of that.
Did you, was there a reply to your whistleblowing and leaking of the material, the 5866 Taiwan material? I mean, and are you working with lawyers to try and?
Not that I know of yet. One reporter did tell me he was considering or planning to ask the DOJ Justice Department about that, but I'm not aware of any response.
But it would be.
But there's no question that what I've put out is, in their eyes, which I think is very misguided, as indictable as any of the other whistleblower cases.
Yes. Let me ask you, I'm struck, at the end of 2019, what were called the Afghan papers were released, and they were dubbed this generation's Pentagon paper. They were brought to light, I believe, by the reporting of the Washington Post with sources. But the media, it did win a Pulitzer Prize, but there was so little attention given it to, I think, Dan. And also, what does it say that there's been so little accounting over decades for the serial abuses of power that you witnessed in the Vietnam War, that we see in the Afghan War, misleading American people for decades? And by the way, you like to say it, I'm sure we all do, like activists like to speak truth to power, but isn't the reality that power often knows the truth? You know, and so I'm just wondering how you make sense of the Afghan papers reception, what that means about our media, and what we can learn in terms of holding accountable public officials who have misled.
Yeah, well, I've always been uneasy about this speaking truth to power. After all, that's what I and many of my colleagues really did seek to do and did do. Yes, other colleagues were lying in the government, but really many people were telling the truth. And that's what the Pentagon papers told me, that the president really had the advice that he needed if he was willing to get out, and that I had no excuse for staying in so as to give him more truth. Other people had given him the truth about the puppet government that we were supporting, which totally deprived what we were doing of any real legitimacy there, I would say. And certainly the lack of promise and progress and so forth. He'd heard all that. It was the public who had been lied to by him
Right.
and other officials in the government. So it really is a question not of telling truth to power, but of telling truths that power doesn't want told to the public and empowering them and to Congress. And that's what whistleblowers do, and that's why they're punished. You know, it just occurred to me, this should be have been more obvious to me, but as you were speaking, just as John Kiriakou is the one person in CIA who went to prison in connection with the torture program, which was illegal on every count, international law, human rights law, American domestic law. One person went to jail in connection with that, and that was Kiriakou, for revealing the name of a torturer. For whistleblower, okay, I don't usually think of myself in exactly the same terms, but it's just, actually it does fit. I was a high-level staff official. I was a GS-18 in the Defense Department and the State Department in Vietnam. All of us had been involved in violating the Constitution in that war, in keeping our mouths shut about when we knew Congress was being lied to and its powers, its war powers were being absolutely thwarted by the false information they were getting. None of us told that, and all of us who participated, I think, could very well have been tried for breaking our oath to support and defend the Constitution. I'm not sure anyone has ever actually been tried for that, but I'm not sure why. That's the oath we took. What occurs to me is, I am, like Kiriakou, I'm the one who was put on trial for revealing these lies and for revealing the truths about this. No other official was put on trial in connection with the Vietnam War, which was a criminal, abusive act, you know, for 30 years. Our policy was unjustifiable for 30 years. So our legal system isn't set up to hold accountable. And our electoral system repeatedly failed because the media had failed to inform the public as to what was really going on. And Nixon was reelected in a landslide after the Pentagon Papers come out. So there we have a case where, to answer your question in a rather ominous way, the public had that information, but hardly acted on it. It wasn't high priority on their part to stop sending American men, in those days, nearly all men, to kill and be killed. And so there's a problem with the public as well, you could say, all throughout. Finally, though, I think an aspect of this is the public is very reluctant to believe that lies or crimes or wrongdoing by precursors, by predecessors of the current president are applying in the present. I wanted people to guess from the fact that 4 presidents in a row, from Truman on, had pursued pretty much the same hopeless, escalatory, violent behavior in Vietnam, and that a 5th one, Nixon, was doing the same, which he was. But to this day, I don't really feel that message has ever gotten through about Nixon, because I didn't have the documents on Nixon. They stopped with Johnson. And without the documents, at least, people just didn't want to believe and managed not to believe, delusionally, that Nixon was getting out and that the war was going to end under his aegis. And the fact that it didn't, the war was still going on when Nixon was forced out of office facing impeachment. But I think very few people have an answer to the question to this day.
That's right.
Why did it go on 6 years after Nixon got into office, 7 years after the Tet Offensive? I don't think people have asked that. They're not very curious. I think I have an answer, but I couldn't prove it with the Pentagon Papers alone, which ended in 1968.
So Dan,
So
I
from
was
that
just,
point
I
of
was going to
view-
say, I hope there will be some questions about the media, because sitting as I do in a part of the media, one I hope does try to bring truth and abuse secrecy. I do think the media plays a role in why people are the way you describe. I wanted to ask you one last question. I have so many, but how do you define patriotism?
You know, it's interesting. I just before this program had written myself a note. Why were the revolutionary sides called in our War of Independence called patriots to a country that didn't yet exist? It was part of the British Empire. Turn this off. Sorry about that. In fact, Nathan Hale was the first American tried for giving information, truth, to Americans. He was a spy for Washington. I have to say that because it turns out young people don't know the name Nathan Hale very much. And somebody just showed me a cartoon 2 days ago that I'd never seen that I liked very much. It was me with a rope around my neck saying, I regret that I have the 38 documents, volumes to give for my country, which is, of course, a paraphrase of Hale's before he was hanged by the British as a traitor. Said, I regret that I have but one life to give for my country. I thought American school children all knew that now, but apparently they don't. Come back to the point that the country was founded by traitors like Nathan Hale and George Washington. Every signer of the Declaration of Independence was very reasonably, in the eyes of the British monarchy and empire, a traitor to a country they'd all been loyal patriots to, or more or less reluctantly, but whatever, in 1775 and 74, and they were traitors in 75 and 76, also having found a different loyalty. I am very loyal to the ideals that we have told ourselves we believed in. And I can hardly think of that as a really sincere aspiration of Thomas Jefferson as a slave owner. When he was writing the words, all men created equal, it seems inescapably hypocritical. And yet it put out a model, an idea of a country, a republic that deserved loyalty, and for which one would be willing to fight and die to uphold those ideals. So I have no doubt in my mind that all of the whistleblowers who were really trying to inform the public, like Snowden, as you say, Drake, Daniel Hale recently was facing prison or in prison because of revealing an out of control program of assassination, the drone program, or Reality Winner, who was revealing interference in our election. I think they more deserve, it's a higher form of patriotism, but I don't want to go into this, who's higher, who's more American, who's more patriotic. I have no doubt at all, these people who were government officials, so far, except for Assange, were fulfilling their oath of office, which is to support and defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic, to a degree that almost no one else in the government has done. What we need is a lot more moral courage in people who feel themselves to be patriotic than we've seen.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Dan. I'm going to turn it over to Erin O'Meara. We have many questions, and thank you so much for the conversation.
Hi, thank you, Katrina, and thank you. Yeah, we do have lots of questions coming in. Maybe we could start with media and moral courage. You took a real risk by leaking the Pentagon Papers. It was courageous of the New York Times and other newspapers to publish them. Do you think that today's media would have the same courage?
Well, I want to congratulate the New York Times for having, they didn't hesitate actually. Charlie Savage, when I offered this to him, as far as I can tell, there is no essential difference between his receipt and holding and publication through the Times of the Pentagon, of the new top secret information that I just gave him, than Julian Assange for the secret information that Chelsea Manning gave the New York Times as well. For example, I very much criticize the New York Times in 2004 for not publishing what James Risen and others had prepared on the total surveillance that was going on, what Ed Snowden later documented. And they withheld that actually for a year because of being told by the White House that there would be blood on their hands if they published. And so they didn't for over a year. Very not good. But on the other hand, with the Pentagon Papers and with this new publication, they've shown that they are willing to do that. And I give them credit for that. And in direct answer to your question, I've thought all along, I wasn't too surprised that they did do it, though I wasn't sure at all that they would. But I've thought for a long time that if you had documents, there would be a good chance of a likelihood that they could get printed. And of course, nowadays you have the web to go to directly, but no one that I can think of did that. Did that actually. Chelsea Manning went first to the Times and the Washington Post with her information, and they showed no interest. That's why she went to WikiLeaks. Snowden did not go to the Times initially or at all, precisely because he knew that they had withheld the information on surveillance back in 2004. So he went to Ben Greenwald and Laura Poitras and others, a few others. So in short, there's no guarantee for a whistleblower that you can get the information out. And coming back to, I think, Katrina's point, or question she raised, there's no guarantee that anything will happen. In fact, as a result of the revolution. In fact, I would have to say, and I want to say this without discouraging people, but being realistic, the odds are against changing the system in a fundamental way, if anything, by revealing these truths to the public, but they're not zero. And when we're talking about the fate of civilization or the fate of our democracy in Constitution, as in Snowden's case, it's worth great personal risk, in my opinion, to take a chance that there will be a change, because everything is at stake.
Thank you. We have a question from Kevin Gribrook. The question is, do you believe the British would release Assange were Biden to drop the charges against him?
Oh, if Biden dropped the appeal, which he should, unquestionably, in my mind, to extradite him, then I know of no reason to the contrary. I believe that Assange would go free and be able to go with his partner and his two children, whom I've spoken with recently. And see, his father and his son are coming over here, father and brother, I'm sorry, are coming over to speak on his behalf. In fact, they're here in this country right now on a speaking tour. So yes, even if Biden doesn't drop the appeal to extradite him, there's a good chance that the British higher courts will release him based on principles of the human rights in Europe to which they subscribe. So it really was disappointing that Biden's Justice Department, and I believe it was a holdover who made this decision from the Trump administration, who renewed the appeal to extradite him against the judge's decision to reject extradition, judge in Britain. And I think it was his last day in office, actually, or it's not what he regards as his last day in office, Trump, he's still there. But the day before he did move out, he appealed to extradite Trump, and it was his Justice Department that had indicted this journalist for the first time in our history. The Obama administration had considered that and rejected it on constitutional grounds and what they called the New York Times problem, that there was no way of justifying an indictment or prosecution of Assange that didn't apply to the Times and many other newspapers. Now, that was the administration of which Biden was vice president. So he could very well have just, when Trump DOJ left office, he could have just dropped the attempt to appeal, but in fact, he renewed it. That was not good. And in fact, Biden himself, I think, had called Assange at the time of the release, back in 2010, a high-tech terrorist, which is an absurd appellation. but it didn't bode well for how Biden would treat. It's still not at all too late to press Biden in Congress and in the public to drop this appeal and let Assange go out into the sunlight for the decade that has been denied that.
Thank you. You've touched on WikiLeaks a bit, but did WikiLeaks release of the 90,000 documents relating to the Afghan war warrant comparison to the Pentagon Papers?
They're very different, as were the Afghan papers that Katrina mentioned, which I don't recall whether they were classified or not, but they were very similar in tone to the Pentagon Papers, although they were kind of mid-level people on the whole. They didn't have the highest level decisions and discussions that the Pentagon Papers did, but it did show that there was not a lack of truth to power inside. It showed that the people involved knew very well that they were dealing with Vietnamistan, that it really was Vietnam, with just the Afghan papers look like the Pentagon Papers with place names changed. It's not very different. And as Katrina said, unhappily, that didn't have a dramatic impact, if any, on our policymaking. But then the Pentagon Papers didn't either. When they came out, more people than before saw the war as illegitimate and should be ended, but they already had reached that position, and Nixon wasn't paying any attention to public opinion on that. The heaviest bombing of the war took place the next year after the Pentagon Papers. So coming back to WikiLeaks, you were saying they are the documents files that Chelsea Manning gave to WikiLeaks, the Iraq war files and the Afghan war files, and also the very first thing, the video of what they called collateral murder, very aptly, of a helicopter gunning down, I think 17 or so civilians, or people in civilian clothes, unarmed. Question, one of them may have had an arm, which was a weapon, which was very common in the city at that point. Two of them, however, were Reuters journalists who were gunned down, and then children in an effort who were in a car that was trying to rescue some of the wounded were also wounded. That's pretty different from the Pentagon Papers, because the Pentagon Papers were high-level decision documents on the whole, and this is field-level war crimes, which both the Afghan war logs and the Iraq war logs showed. For example, that Chelsea's material on Afghanistan showed that we were, Iraq rather, that we were handing people over that we knew were going to be tortured. And we did that by the hundreds, if not thousands, in Iraq, which is a clear-cut criminal act in international law and in our own law. To give people over what you know are to be tortured is as criminal as doing the torture yourself. And that went into the Obama administration, Chelsea stuff. So Obama was faced, in effect, with evidence that there was a policy here, undoubtedly accepted, or if not driven from the top, that he was implicated in. It could have been implicated in front of the, so there was an evidence of a clear-cut war crime. Likewise, it came out that there was at least 20,000 civilian deaths that had not been otherwise reported, that were known inside, that, we said we're not counting bodies anymore, no more body count. Another lie. It turned out they were counting, and there were 20,000. Well, remember, that's more than we've lost in the Middle East altogether in all these wars. There were 20,000 extra civilians killed, brought out. Now, nothing like that is in the Pentagon Papers. In fact, in other words, field level war crimes. In fact, I think there's almost no calculation in those 7,000 pages of how many people we were killing in Vietnam. There was no consideration whatever. Body counts of enemies, yes, who included largely civilians, but overall counts of how many people were being killed as a result of our wrongful policy, no one wanted to know that. And they didn't know that. So it was an unconcern there that was exhibited. And as I say, what we found from Chelsea Manning's and later Ed Snowden's material, highly relevant. Hard to say that it succeeded in changing policy. Was it worth their taking the risks that they did? Well, they feel so. I felt so. There's a war's worth of lives at stake. And for that, of course, one's own life is worthy of being put at risk.
Thank you. We have a question from Michael Warburton. The question, speaking of truth to power, might there be any benefit in exploring some of the known betrayals at the end of the Second World War?
Frankly, I'm not quite sure what you're talking about there. The known betrayals at the end. What are we talking about? Do you know?
Sorry, I'm just reading his question. Maybe he can elaborate
on that. I'm not sure what he's talking about.
Sure, and he's got actually another one, so let me go to another one from him. Listening to your comments, he says this would seem a strong argument for application of the public trust doctrine. Why aren't we talking about it?
Is there a public trust doctrine? What I do know is that the public has always and is still trusting the incumbent president, whether they voted for him or not, generally far more than was deserved. Should we have a basis for public trust? Should there be a public accountability doctrine that would allow defendants to argue that what they're doing is in the interest, is a public interest? And as Yochai Benkler, professor at Harvard, has called for a public accountability defense, saying that this was put out because the public officials were betraying their trust. And again, I'm not sure just what the doctrine is that's being spoken of. Certainly, a thought comes to my mind. I once spoke to a very large crowd in connection with a nuclear reactor, and I guess it was this San Diego, maybe, I've forgotten exactly. Very large crowd, which led a governor, actually Jerry Brown, come to speak to it. And it just reminds me that someone after that, they weren't entirely crazy about having a politician helicopter in, as he did, and address this crowd. And somebody said, do you trust Jerry Brown? And I remember, Jerry Brown is a friend of mine, actually, now, and has been for a long time. But I said, trust is not an appropriate attitude to have toward a public official. And so somebody said, well, what then? And I said, vigilance. And I think that applies now. I think we need a public vigilance doctrine.
That makes a lot of sense. So you've long been alarmed by the possibility of nuclear war. How likely do you still think that possibility is? And I'd like to add on a question from Kevin Gribroke. Knowing the consequence, why would the Anglo-American establishment be willing to risk nuclear war over Taiwan?
For 70 years, we have threatened an insane action as a basis for our alliance policies. And we have promised our allies, and I say 70 years, that's the very beginning of the nuclear era, at the beginning of which we had a monopoly. So there was not to be feared retaliation. It was a first use policy only. There was nobody had the basis for second use. We were already promising Europe that we would use nuclear weapons in the event of a Russian move against Berlin, as in 1948, when the Russians had no nuclear weapons. That would have been, in its way, mad at that point. But a few years later, we have a different dimension of madness when the Russians had the ability to destroy Europe, and eventually, by the mid-60s, to destroy us and really the world, though we didn't know that then, through nuclear winter, which they hadn't escalated. So we were threatening, in fact, nuclear winter that would starve most people on Earth by the smoke, lofting of smoke from burning cities into the stratosphere. That has always been true, and is now we know it, though it doesn't seem to have affected our plans. What I'm saying is that the threat to initiate nuclear war against a nuclear weapons state like China or North Korea or Russia above all, which has the ability to create nuclear winter many times over as we do, that's a threat to do something insane. And so we look at how could we fight over Taiwan, for example? How could we do that, even threaten it, even risk it over Taiwan? Well, what I wanted to reveal to people was, if you think that's crazy, in 1958, people who I would say are not more stupid than the ones today, Eisenhower, Dulles, the others, are not different really as statesmen, were willing to take actions that would lead to Russian retaliation, they figured, they believed, which in turn would lead to full implementation of our war plans. If that had happened and it was left up to Mao to trigger that, basically, he chose not to, fortunately. But we passed that trigger to Mao, we would not be here if those plans had been carried out. Now, you read that and you say, well, this reads like dialogue by Terry Southern or Stanley Kubrick for Dr. Strangelove. We have the head of the Pacific Air Force, Lawrence Cooter, saying, I'm willing to limit this to using Hiroshima-type weapons against gun emplacements, to limit it if that will keep some, quote, exact quote, misguided humanitarian from limiting our response to obsolete iron bombs and hot lead. Well, yeah, very good Terry Southern line from Dr. Strangelove. It would have been a little over the top then, but this is in a top secret document, which in a way you can give them credit for keeping that from us for 50 years. That's why hasn't ever been declassified before. And there's others equally crazy. Well, I'm saying that to talk right now of defending Taiwan, which is an arguable policy, which we're moving very much toward, without renouncing the threat and the preparation to initiate nuclear war, without a no first use policy, with a first use promise to do that, is crazy. And could these reasonable people surrounding Biden possibly entertain such craziness? Well, and could the public support it? Look at the ability, which we've seen now this year, for a sizable part, the majority of the Republican Party, to believe that Trump is still president, or that there's no real man-made climate change, or that the pandemic is, if not a hoax, is very greatly exaggerated, is not a real problem. We're seeing more blatantly the ability of large numbers of people who are not in themselves crazy individually or monstrous, nevertheless threaten the survival of civilization in two counts by exploring and bring up more oil and fossil fuel that should stay in the ground for the benefit of future generations, and by making threats and preparing to initiate nuclear war, which should not be done in any circumstances. So I'm saying it's simply be wrong to look back on that 58 crisis and say, well, thank goodness we don't have people like that making plans like that anymore. That's not true, sorry to say. Those plans exist right now, contingency plans, whether they have any advocates like Lawrence Cooter or LeMay, probably not actually in this new world, but a readiness to consider initiating nuclear war, that's in print. People like Eldridge Colby have talked about, if we use tactical nuclear weapons against China, they might not reply. And that's true. They might not. What is that? 1 in 1,000? But in any case, it is very profitable to prepare for this. It serves our alliances, it serves our hegemony and so forth. And that's enough to get people who are very much like the ones we've had in the past to take those gambles for us.
Thank you. Well, I guess, are there any truly reasonable people in government today? So is there anybody who really understands the urgency of nuclear abolition? Are there any legislative allies who get it?
Yes, there are. Actually, Ed Markey, Senator Ed Markey of Massachusetts, has many times sent letters with about 10 or so of his colleagues, people like Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren and a number of others, to write letters to Obama. It goes back ways, and Trump and Biden, calling for eliminating ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles, which are the trigger, the detonating course to the doomsday machine, this nuclear winter machine that we built up. The ICBMs are vulnerable, and there's a strong incentive in the case of either tactical or strategic warning to say, use them before you lose them. And I think that delusional aspect that they might limit damage if they go in first is held, as far as I can tell, in Russia as well as in the US. And it's a delusion that may really bring doomsday about. Now, Adam Smith, the chairman of the Armed Services Committee in the House, has for long been for abolishing nuclear weapons, as like former Defense Secretary William Perry or former head of the Strategic Command, Cartwright. And I think, in fact, there is a Markey bill. Several people in Congress have a bill right now for eliminating ICBMs, especially the new ones, the ground-based strategic deterrent, so forth, and thus, eliminating this trigger. But they've never been close to a majority, let alone a 2/3 majority, and they get overruled all this time. The same is true, by the way, for no first use. Adam Smith has, did I mention this, has a no first use. He is against ICBMs. He also has a no first use resolution, which very much deserves support. But the prospects of getting that when at the same time, the Biden administration is renewing these contracts to Northrop Grumman for the new ICBMs, let alone getting rid of the old ones. The votes, the donations, the campaign contributions, and the profits of the aerospace industry have always managed to win, as a matter of fact, as an incentive over let's start dismantling the doomsday machine. That simply doesn't have the kind of votes and profits involved in sustaining it.
Thank you. From David Hartzog. In the name of national security, our government leaders are willing to put an end to human life on our beautiful planet. Why don't they consider common security or shared security for all nations and peoples, as a much safer, saner, and wise way to get national security?
Yes. Full disclosure here, David Hartzog is a good friend of mine and a mentor of mine. He's been a leader of anti-nuclear and anti-war activism his whole life. And I'm very happy to hear from him. This point that he raises is a very positive one. And that is, there is another concept of security that's far better suited to sustaining human life as opposed to microscopic life on this planet. And that is actually, when you asked earlier about were there any statesmen, I can very much mention a non-US statesman who did get the picture, and that was Gorbachev, Mikhail Gorbachev. And he had picked up the notion from anti-nuclear forces in general of cooperative security, common security, those were his phrases, collaborative. And it's very obvious that these many problems in the world, and I'll name nuclear, climate, pandemics, require cooperation above all, including among states that are not democratic, like China, for example. Cooperation with China is absolutely essential here. And to talk about China as an enemy that cannot be negotiated with, collaborated with, compromised with, worked with, is accepting something near extinction I think, of us for the human species. So yes, the idea, for example, Gorbachev in 78, I think it was. All right. No, much later.
88.
I mean, much later. I mean, yeah, 88.
88.
Yeah, 88. Sorry. It's been going on for a long time. Uh, did actually, to be precise, Katrina, I believe, is it 88 or it was 88 perhaps, when he withdrew tanks from East Germany.
Oh, forgive
It was
me.
December 7th, and I always get the year
I'm
wrong.
thinking of an 88 at the summit. He said a nuclear war should never be waged and can never be won.
Well, now to give credit to an American here, that phrase was first used by Ronald Reagan, a Republican, who actually did. He did actually abhor the idea of nuclear war more than people understood, and unfortunately had a delusional attachment to Star Wars, to anti-ballistic missiles and so forth, which kept him from really agreeing with Gorbachev at the Reykjavik summit, which I think was in '86, to abolish nuclear weapons, starting with ICBMs, by the way, and then intermediate range weapons. And then they talked about all weapons. The only time that such a prospect was talked about between two heads of state, to my knowledge. Now, would his establishments of either one of them really permitted that to happen if they had agreed to get rid of them? Hard to believe at the time, and even harder still. Nevertheless, they were taking the problem seriously, and they were discussing it. So Gorbachev, as I say, then after that, after Reykjavik, actually took thousands of tanks out of East Germany. So I remember it was mentioned on a speech he gave to the UN on December 7th. And the Times quoted a colonel in the Pentagon as saying, "This is worse than Pearl Harbor," because as Arbatov, Russian advisor at that time, said, "We're doing something terrible to you. We're taking away your enemy." And taking these tanks out, the first reaction was, well, there'll be old tanks that he'll just move back to Western USSR. Say, no, there are best first line tanks. Actually, come and take a look. And then they said, well, they won't actually destroy them. And the Russians said, Gorbachev, come and watch us destroy them. And it was taking away the offensive capability, actually, of the Warsaw Pact considerably, and made really the ending of the Cold War possible. This kind of move, a kind of each one taking unilateral steps and inviting the other to join it rather than negotiating forever, is somebody called it reciprocal initiatives, is quite possible, very promising. It worked in that case. And I could give other examples, but it's gone, by the way, in favor of returning to Cold War for both Russia and China, which I can only rationalize as seeing them as enemies, not merely as rivals, not merely as flawed great nations like us. Whether the flaws are different in some respects, both very flawed. For example, I'll give a really quite big example. Neither Russia nor China has done anything like our invasion of Iraq in the last 20 years. You can look at what they do to the Uyghurs, terrible, no doubt, against humanity. And or you can look at Myanmar, you can look at Russia, you can look at any of those things. Trump didn't do that either. I mean, it's unusual. The invasion of Iraq and the 20-year war against Afghanistan are human rights violations that really do actually outweigh or overshadow, which isn't to say that makes the others all right. It doesn't. It does mean, though, that to stigmatize these others as people that we can't deal with, when China mocks that, I have to sympathize with that, although I don't sympathize with Xi very often, Xi. But we do have to, the idea of a Cold War where it's very good for some people. It's very good for the military industrial complexes in both nations. And the Russians have a military industrial complex too now and have had for a long time, but now it's very openly, in effect, capitalistic, which it didn't used to be. It's not nearly the shape of ours. Ours is exceptional, unique in the world. And Eisenhower's warning against that, he having been one of the major figures that promoted over 8 years, but his warning was very apt. And my friend Ray McGovern says it isn't just an MIC, a military industrial complex. It's really a Mickey Mat, military industrial congressional. And Eisenhower intended to put in congressional in the beginning, but he was persuaded not to because he was giving a speech to Congress, that speech. So it's a military industrial congressional intelligence, media, academic, and think tank. I think that's Ray McGovern's. You could probably add somewhere near finance, but it's very powerful. And neither party at this moment is remotely interested in bucking and going against that those institutions. And with, as I say, the exceptions of individuals who very much deserve to be supported.
Thank you. We have a question from Eric Skamser. He asks, what do you think of WikiLeaks' release of DNC documents during the 2016 election?
First of all, did WikiLeaks have a journalistic right to put information out? I think that can't be argued with, and to say that they shouldn't have put it out at all. I will say, because I've often made it clear, I don't agree with my friend Julian Assange's judgment in 2015 or 2016, when he actually expressed the word on Twitter that an outsider to the general establishment like Trump might be less bad than Hillary Clinton. I think that was a great misjudgment, which was shared by a number of other progressives that I know, and I thought they were quite wrong in backing a third party like Jill Stein or Howie Hawkins or the others, because the Democrats were so bad that it was just as good to defeat them. I thought that was terrible judgment, and I think that was shared by Julian. In his case, it so happens I give him some extenuating factors there, such as having been confined in one room for 7.5 years at that point. I give him some slack on having really bad judgment, keeping in mind, by the way, that what he's indicted for now has nothing to do with 2016 or 2015. It has to do with the releases in 2010, like the collateral murder video, which I think were absolutely justified, and I back him. But in terms of how can, I think the impact, and I think WikiLeaks had some influence on the election. That's terrible in 2016, as did even more, I would say, Comey's behavior at that time, his releases, and you could even, various people you can point to. I have to say, third party, Jill Stein contributed, I think, to that, in my opinion. The effect is terrible. So, as I often say, Julian is accused of many things, and I like to say, Julian Assange is not a perfect person, unlike you and me. And it's what I say about the nations in general. In this case, I like to think that even if it were Stephen Banning being extradited for journalistic activity from Britain, and I, despise Bannon's views and efforts, but I hope and I think I would be supporting his defense against the Espionage Act for acts of journalism as much as I do Julian Assange.
Thank you very much. This was incredible. So grateful for your time, and I'm going to ask Katrina to come on for our close.
I think the world needs to be run by 90-year-olds, Dan. I think you and Gorbachev, who is a great admirer of yours, who turned 90 in March, have a sense of what real security is and how to think about a world without nuclear weapons. As I said, the idea that a nuclear war cannot be waged, cannot be won, must never be waged. But thank you for your courage, your conviction, for reminding us that it's not trust, but it's vigilance, or maybe trust but verify. And Gore Vidal, who you knew, used to call us the United States of amnesia. I think you brought us together today with a very powerful lesson of history, of moral consciousness, and reflections on the power of whistleblowers. Because I agree with you, change is so hard to make in this country, but we at the nation believe there are no lost causes, only causes waiting to be won. That keeps us going. And the work that we should be doing, you make us think hard about in terms of the secrecy, the Espionage Act. And I do hope there is some movement on that and that we can cover that if it moves in ways you had hoped with the leaking of the Taiwan documents. But thank you very much for today. Last thing I'll say is you mentioned Terry Southern. Terry stopped covering reality. And when he saw General Rumsfeld, he said, reality has exceeded satire. Anyway, thank you. Thank you very, very much for taking time.
Thank you, Katrina. I'm a very old subscriber to, I mean, long-term and old subscriber to the nation, which is my voice in media,
Thank you.
the one I listen to most.